What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and if I have a guilty pleasure, it's Chinese buffets, probably. But if I had two guilty pleasures, one of them would be the Star Wars Armada miniatures game from Atomic Mass Games, formerly from Fantasy Flight. Back in August, I made a video about the announcement that development on new products for the game was being temporarily halted. Star Wars Armada is no stranger to long lead times between releases, going over a year, almost 2 years, between release cycles for the game in the past. That said, the community and mechanics of the game have been good enough to sustain a community even through these periods of new release drought. During that video, I said something along the lines of, one thing that I hope the development team would consider putting time into, instead of releasing new models for the game, would be releasing new card packs instead. And lo and behold, today, April 7th, 2022, that is what we got with the release of the Rapid Reinforcements Print and Play pack. Now, this rules pack is really cool, and I think exactly what the game needs to sustain its community and sustain enthusiasm for the game. Now, this pack is just a PDF on the Atomic Mass Games site that you can just download and print out and play with. The cool thing about Star Wars Armada is that a lot of the game is sort of model agnostic. Your ship's presence in the battle space is determined by their base and the particular cardboard cutout pieces that fit into the base, and the models on top of them, while really the main draw of the game, are entirely aesthetic. But they are very aesthetic, to be fair. This means that the game can easily support alternative rules for particular ships or squadrons within it, because all you need to do is have an alternate stat card that you can print out and show your opponent. Given the setting of the game in the Star Wars universe and the fact that a lot of the ships and characters in Star Wars occupy different roles throughout the course of the narrative, this also opens up the game canonically to allow for play of ships in multiple different factions over different eras of the Star Wars franchise. So let's talk about exactly what is in this pack. I'm going to give my thoughts on it. I'm going to try to explain, for people who are less familiar with Star Wars Armada, the mechanical importance of some of these rules, and I'm going to go over my very preliminary thoughts on them. Now, currently, after the release of the Clone Wars expansion, which was the last release cycle that Star Wars Armada received, the game is sitting at 4 factions, with the Galactic Empire, Rebel Alliance, Separatist Alliance, and Galactic Republic all represented. That means you can play Stormtroopers, Rebels, clones, or robots, all in the same game. And this Rapid Reinforcements pack has included a ship and squadron, a character squadron, for each of these factions. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that the name of the release is Rapid Reinforcements number 1. This means that the door is open for future Rapid Reinforcements packs moving on into the future. Now, going down the new cards included in this pack, one at a time, starting with the Galactic Empire. We start with an Imperial version of the Venator II class Star Destroyer. These are the big Jedi cruisers that are used in the Clone Wars, primarily by the fleets of the Galactic Republic. Now, given that Star Destroyers are already sort of the mainstay of Imperial fleets, I don't know how transformative the inclusion of this ship is going to be. It functions as sort of a close-range brawler, but doesn't have quite the same damage output as other Star Destroyers like Imperial 1 class. The big upside of the Venator 2 is that it does include 2 slots for missile systems. Missiles in Star Wars Armada tend to be very close-range weapons that deal a lot of damage when close into your opponent. This could open up some interesting combos for Venator Star Destroyers, being able to use missile systems alongside weapons teams to confirm that missiles like advanced proton torpedoes and assault concussion missiles trigger their critical effects, alongside abilities to increase the maneuverability of the ship, like Moff Jerjerrod, could make it an agile, close-in brawler. The maneuverability of the ship leaves something to be desired when comparing it to a standard Imperial Star Destroyer. On the flip side, however, the new incarnation of Darth Vader that's included is super exciting. Darth Vader is one of the most represented characters in the entire Star Wars universe in Star Wars Armada. I think appropriately so, because he's in like every one of the movies, basically. He came with a squadron in the core set in his TIE Advanced. He's also represented as a commander who can strip defenses from your ships to allow them to reroll dice and deal additional damage. He's also an officer who can choke out other officers or commanders for their failure and let you even further reroll dice. Now he has a second squadron, this time in a TIE Defender. TIE Defenders are my favorite squadron in all of the game. They are a jack-of-all-trades unit that can both attack ships effectively with the bomber keyword, but also be able to mix it up with squadron. Darth Vader's previous squadron ability of his critical icons adding damage to his damage total, even though they normally don't do that for regular squadrons, is also reflected here. And he retains that pretty high damage value from the TIE Defender squadron, rolling 2 black dice, 1 red dice, and 1 blue dice in his anti-squadron armament. Now, for those who don't know how Armada dice mechanics work, it's a very simple system. Essentially, you will roll a dice pool with the colors of dice represented by whatever your attacks are. The facings of those dice may have 1 or more hit icons on them, or some different icons that inflict special effects, like accuracy, for example, and you will deal however many icons you rolled as damage to your opponent. Your opponent then has defensive tokens they can spend to reduce or negate that damage. Red dice tend to be very spiky. They have a double hit facing on them, but they also have a lot of blank facings on them, meaning that re-rolling red dice can be very good in order to confirm that they actually hit their target, whereas blue dice are very consistent with no blank faces on them. They just have either hits, critical hits, or accuracy icons. Black dice are inaccurate but can deal high damage, with facings that deal both a critical hit and hit result, and a couple blank facings as well. Critical hits will normally deal damage to ships, but also inflict an additional effect. Some upgrade cards let you deal extra damage on critical hits, and generally speaking, they will deal system damage to enemy ships that will make them less effective moving forward in the game. The downside is that squadrons tend to ignore critical hit icons. When attacking a squadron, your critical hit icons basically don't count, but Darth Vader's ability makes them count as regular hits. This means that having a bunch of black dice in his pool with the ability to get potentially a critical hit plus hit facing on those dice makes his damage very spiky. This is compounded by the Adept 2 keyword, which lets him reroll 2 dice whenever he's attacking. This means that despite the fact that his dice pool is relatively inconsistent, with those 2 rerolls built in and the ability to potentially be dealing double damage on those dice, he's going to be able to punch for an immense amount of damage, even if he's attacking enemy squadrons. He has 2 red dice in his bomber armament, which again is very spiky. Each of those dice could either be dealing 2 damage or 0 damage, but with the ability to reroll both of them, it actually becomes much more consistent. The bomber keyword as well allows you to get damage from your critical icons and deal critical damage to enemy ships, which squadrons can't normally do, which is one of the things that makes TIE Defender squadrons so good at attacking enemy ships. One thing I don't know is whether or not Darth Vader's critical icons on his red dice are going to count as a damage for his own ability and a damage for the bomber ability in addition to inflicting critical hits. I'm not 100% sure that's how the rules work. I don't know if the bomber keyword supersedes his regular ability. Either way, in this TIE Defender, Darth Vader is super fast with that speed of 5, the fastest speed for any squadron in the game, has a pretty healthy hit point pool of 6 hull, and combine that with some very good defensive tokens. The Brace defense token allows him to half incoming damage, whereas the Scatter defense token allows him to entirely ignore incoming damage, meaning that pinning this guy down and killing him, even while he's doing ridiculous damage back to you, is pretty difficult. On top of that, he also has the Rogue keyword, which means that he can act normally even if he isn't being commanded by a ship, a downside that squadrons normally have, and he's only 25 points. He is 4 points more than the other TIE Defender ace, Merrick Steele, who comes in at a pretty chunky 21, and he's 9 points more than a regular TIE Defender squadron. But given the immense amount of additional damage and flexibility that Darth Vader has, I think you're going to be seeing this guy a lot. Like I said, TIE Defenders are my favorite ship to play in Star Wars Armada. They're a very good jack of all trades with the highest speed in the game, one of the highest hull values in the game, good anti-ship and anti-squadron attacks, meaning that if you're playing in a competitive setting, there's no situation in which they're not useful. Given that squadrons can vary wildly in their usefulness, whether they're attacking enemy squadrons or enemy ships, this is something that's important to keep in mind when you're building competitively, and Darth Vader's always going to be a good include in an Imperial list. Now let's move on to the Rebel cards out of this expansion pack. First off, we have the Providence class Carrier. This is a separatist ship that I think canonically the Rebels pulled out of mothballs and were able to buy old versions of. One thing that Rebels are very good at is commanding squadrons, although one thing that they've never had before is a big carrier that does that effectively. Now, the Rebel version of the Providence class Carrier, despite its moniker as a carrier, actually has a relatively low squadron value of 2. meaning that when it tries to command squadrons, it can only pick 2 of them. Generally speaking, you're trying to get 3 to 4 in order to be an optimally effective carrier. That said, the upgrades available to the Providence class carrier, those being weapon teams, offensive retrofits, and support teams, have the potential to create some very interesting combos when you're pushing your squadrons around. You can use upgrades like boosted comms or expanded hangar bays to make it more effective at ordering squadrons. With its 2 officer slots, you can combo together officers like flight commanders and characters like Adar Talon, and on top of that, you have access to upgrades like flight controllers and fighter coordination teams in order to assemble every component of a fighter combo on a single ship. Because they tend to rely on smaller ships for a lot of their fighter support, Rebels have typically had to spread these upgrades across the majority of their fleet and haven't really had a good place to concentrate all of them on a single platform, and that's something that the Providence class carrier gives them. Whether they take this over something like an MC-80 command cruiser, I don't know, but it is an interesting alternative to one of the more standard Rebel ships. Hera Syndulla is the character Rebel squadron included in this release. She's in an X-Wing and sports some classic X-Wing statistics, including a relatively mediocre movement of 3 and hull value of 5. She does have a good anti-ship armament with a single black dice and the bomber keyword, meaning she's typically dealing 1 to 2 damage to a ship every time she fires at it, and she has some interesting abilities. While she's activated, friendly squadrons that have escort, including other X-Wing squadron for example, gain Adept 1, which allows them to reroll 1 of their dice when attacking. In Star Wars Armada, you can actually reroll a single dice multiple times, meaning that an X-Wing squadron that only has a red anti-ship armament can be rerolling because of Hera's ability. If she's gone first and led the attack, then also rerolling from an ability like Bomber Command Center. Obviously also works if they're fighting enemy squadrons, and can be comboed with other reroll effects like Torin Far's ability to reroll blue dice. I really like the thematic implications of Hera's ability. She literally has to lead the squadron in, and once she does that, she gives abilities to your escorts. Anything that encourages escort play in Rebels is pretty cool. Although it does affect YT-1300s, which for a while were a little bit of an overrepresented squadron in Rebel lists. Moving on to Galactic Republic, we see another port of a Galactic Empire unit, this time back in time to the Republic, giving them access to the Victory 1 class Star Destroyer. The Victory 1 is a much maligned unit in Galactic Empire, really only good once you put a bunch of time into upgrading it. They tend not to be particularly tanky, while being relatively slow and for some reason focused on short-range combat, which are things that don't tend to go well together. A Victory 1 in a Galactic Empire build can be constructed into sort of a hybrid cruiser carrier, which is kind of interesting, but I think they're being pushed in a different direction for Republic. In this case, just like we talked about with the Venator 2 Star Destroyer in Galactic Empire, these guys get access to 2 missile slots, allowing them to build combinations of powerful missile effects that do massive damage at short range. The Victory 1's armament, firing a bunch of black dice which are only useful at very short range, means that it has the potential to be one of the highest damage output close-in brawling ships in the entire game. The biggest difference between the Galactic Republic Victory 1 and the Galactic Empire Victory 1 is the inclusion of a support team slot. This, without any other upgrades, can give this ship access to a speed-enhancing upgrade like engine techs, which will allow it to perform an additional movement after its normal movement. Unlike analogous ships like the Acclamator, Victories are only able to move at speed 2 and are relatively unmaneuverable, meaning the inclusion of the support team allowing it to make an additional movement at the end allows it to close in with its enemy much more quickly and get those missile systems to bear. A big downside for the Galactic Republic here is that the Victory-specific title Harrow, which dramatically increases its maneuverability when making short maneuvers, such as the one granted by engine techs, is locked to the Galactic Empire faction, which means that this guy, while he is going to be able to move relatively quickly, is still not going to be making too many turns while doing so. This basically makes this guy, I think, a little bit of a nuclear missile, something that can bullet directly towards your opponent and really try to brawl with them. That fits kind of in the standard game plan of a lot of Galactic Republic lists that tend to try to play a relatively aggressive and tanky game plan, sharing shields between each other. So whether or not this breaks into the top echelon of units that can perform a similar function, I don't know. And it is important to note that both the Separatist Alliance and Galactic Republic don't have a lot of ships available to them to begin with, meaning that the addition of extra ships, regardless, is going to be a good increase in the flexibility of the faction overall. More choices is more better. Moving on, we have Anakin Skywalker returning as the character Squadron. Anakin's other Squadron appearance in Star Wars Armada is in a Y-Wing Squadron, which is a dedicated bomber, and he's one of the most flexible bomber units in the game, being unable to be locked down by enemy fighter screens. This version of Anakin is in a Delta 7 Aether Sprite Squadron, which is a much faster and more offensively oriented interceptor-style unit. And this version of Anakin, instead of being a flexible bomber, is much more of an anti-squadron brawler. In this case, Anakin includes some of the keywords that we've talked about earlier in the video. He has Adept 2, allowing him to reroll 2 dice when he's attacking. He also has Dodge 1, allowing him to force an enemy to reroll when attacking against him. With the same defensive tokens that Darth Vader has, a Brace and a Scatter, that can mean that Anakin's going to be very difficult to pin down, although only 4 Hull is relatively easy to chew through once you can lock down his Scatter token with accuracy effects. Like I mentioned before, Anakin's special ability is relatively offensively oriented. If he deals damage with an attack against an enemy squadron, he deals an additional damage to 2 other squadrons within distance 1 of the. This allows him to sink into big bricks of enemies and be exploding out lots of damage against all of them. A very cool and thematic ability for this hot-headed little dude. Last, but certainly not least, we have the inclusion of Gozanti-class cruisers for the Separatist Alliance. Unfortunately, Separatists get a little bit snubbed here. They don't get additional character squadron. The Separatist character squadrons tend to be kind of hit or miss, so it would have been nice to see them get an extra one, but I don't think it's the end of the world that they didn't. That said, Gozanti-class cruisers are a very big deal in any faction, and Separatists especially. These little guys are a flotilla unit, meaning that while they operate like a ship, they essentially don't count as a ship for the purposes of victory conditions, meaning that if the rest of your fleet is destroyed, your cruisers will run away and also be counted as destroyed. That said, they allow you to get ship activations into your fleet at a very inexpensive cost, at only 27 points. You can get these guys for basically as much as you get one of these character squadrons that we've been talking about throughout the entire video. Gozanti-class cruisers were originally an Imperial unit and very good at a fleet support role. They're able to take a lot of support-style upgrades in order to buff your larger ships while staying as far as they can away from the combat. On the flip side, the Separatist Gozanti cruisers are a little bit more offensively oriented, able to mount a weapons team as well as an ion cannon. While generally speaking, you want to keep your flotilla units as cheap as possible because they're mostly there to pad your activation count and allow you to out-activate your opponent to get more control over the flow of the game, the inclusion of this ion cannon actually opens up some interesting combos. You can make them a little harder to kill with a defensive upgrade like point defense ion cannons, which makes them much more difficult for squadrons to take down, since you can force enemy bombers to reroll their hit rolls against you. Because these guys also have a scatter token like a lot of fighters, they can entirely ignore some attacks from larger ships, meaning that one of the best ways to get rid of them is swarming them with smaller fighters and forcing them to use their token over and over again until it's burnt out and they can no longer evade attacks. Something like a point defense ion cannon can make that a lot harder. If you want to play more offensively, an upgrade like SW7 ion batteries allow you to confirm that 100% of your anti-ship attacks hit. That's because the one miss condition of a 1 blue dice attack against an enemy ship is rolling an accuracy icon. Accuracy icons allow you to tell your opponent that they can't use certain defense tokens against you. However, if you're not dealing any damage, the use of those defense tokens won't do anything. That said, SW7s and weapons battery attacks allow you to replace those accuracy icons with extra hits, meaning that your singleton little blue dice are going to be automatically dealing damage to enemy ships, which is pretty cute, if a little bit pricey. Alternatively, you could use those weapons battery techs to help confirm blue critical effects. One of the upsides of the ion cannon upgrade slot is that it allows you to take some supporting weapons that will be able to deal debuffing effects to enemy ships. Most of them are contingent on blue critical icons, but if you have those weapons battery techs, you have a significant chance of either naturally rolling a blue critical or flipping an accuracy into a blue critical. While it's not a 100% chance, still getting a very good chance to activate an ability like MS1 ion cannons, standard ion cannon batteries, or even heavy ion emplacements to drain enemy shields, and open up some interesting combo plays in the Separatist lineup. At the very least, though, the inclusion of a 27-point ship to pad activations in a Separatist list is a very big deal, since previously the cheapest option that the faction had access to was the 47-point and relatively mediocre hard sell class transport. This guy allows you to save a full 20 points on your activation padding support ships and look good while doing it. As somebody who plays both Galactic Empire and Separatist Alliance, this is exciting because I now get to use some of my Imperial ships with my Separatists, which is just value. Anyway, this video ended up being way longer than I expected it to, so thanks everyone for watching. I really appreciate it. Let me know down in the comments if you're excited about these new upgrades for the Star Wars Armada game. Really, I'm just excited for it. I'm excited that Star Wars Armada content is back, and I really appreciate Atomic Mass Games for releasing free rules for their game. Can you imagine that? Free rules. Imagine a 40K player seeing this and being like, what? The rules are free? You don't have to buy a $50 codex for that? That's crazy. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone again who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those people are phenomenal, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.